The challenge is when you're working with the community, the focus needs to be on the community. We have to start thinking multimodally. We have to start thinking more innovatively on our land uses.
We'll have a conversation about that when finally I get my act together and launch the the program. Hey, this is the Air Mobility Show. I'm Ahmad Malik with my co-host Nadia Park. Today's guest is an absolutely fantastic guy, a veteran of aviation industry, come from a Air Force background. Welcome, Clint. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's a pleasure to be here.
Clint has been working in a different facet of advanced air mobility that we don't talk about a lot. He is basically focusing on the infrastructure part of the advanced air mobility. It's a very exciting, focus that you have, and I think a lot of aviation industry or AM industry is constantly focusing on the technology, the eVTOL technology, the drones, unmanned drones, and all that sort of stuff. And one of the things that I always see a big gap in is what you do. So how do you got into that? First of all, just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we get into what you do.
Going way back, my aviation career started, when I joined the Air Force back in the 90s. And one of the reasons why I joined the Air Force was because I didn't leave myself with very many other options. So when I joined the Air Force, I started my career out as a avionics and sensor maintainer on the AC-130 gunships. And a common theme throughout my Air Force career is that I was working on such specialized systems and in such specialized missions that I was frustrated because I thought that none of these things was going to help me, get a job on the outside. After my first enlistment, I cross trained into the airfield management career field. It gave me a really dynamic start to the career. So most of my career at Kirkuk and at Patrick Air Force Base was primarily supporting helicopter missions, vertical lift missions, and we also had some UAV missions as well. And unbeknownst to me, it really set me up for the work that I'm doing now and in trying to enable safe vertical lift operations in new dynamic environments. Where we don't traditionally have a high tempo of operations. And so almost my Air Force career was purpose built to prepare me for what I'm doing. Now in the civilian side. I became passionate about the things that planners are trying to solve problems for. And, it was really eye opening to me. And it helped me recognize that, yes, I did love aviation very, very much. But what really got me up every day in the military and even afterwards was that service component, so serving the community, serving others, serving my country, whatever it might be. If I'm serving, someone else, it makes me feel better about the work that I'm doing. I then transitioned over to the Utah Department of Transportation as a transportation planner. And the team that I was serving there was actually looking at um, different land uses that complement transportation planning and vice versa. In northern Utah, because we're geographically constrained by mountains on one side, a lake on the other, we can only grow so much, and we're expecting a population growth of over of almost doubling, the metro area in Salt Lake. And he said, "There's no physical way we can double the lane miles, on our existing transportation system. We have to start thinking multimodally. We have to start thinking more innovatively on our land uses. We got to figure out what we need to do to get more use and more efficiency out of our existing system." And I started trying to bring aviation into those discussions, which they weren't thinking about at the time. They were thinking buses, trains, highways, everything
Yeah,
essentially but aviation. And so,
yeah.
um,
Everything on the
yeah,
road that is already congested.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
there's a focus on leveraging existing infrastructure, making better use out of existing infrastructure. And so we have a number of airports, scattered throughout the metropolitan area. And I was like, all right, let's not forget about those, not just as transportation nodes, but also as anchors for land uses, that might
yeah.
complement the set in transportation nodes. And as I was doing that, I caught the attention of the aeronautics director under the Department of Transportation and had a couple conversations with him, and he vowed to steal me from the planning division and bring me over to aeronautics. So I started going out to the different cities and regions and economic development districts and talking about their airport, talking about the airport's role and their regional economic development strategies and how we can bolster that. And again, not just the airport as a mode of transportation enabler, but as a land use anchor as well. And so, what other land uses could we start looking at around the airports that's going to complement the airport and its use? And it doesn't have to be a direct aeronautical use; it can be a an ancillary use that still benefits from the airport being there.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I
got a
mean, a
lot of
lot of
success with
airports do something like an industrial use, or not
yeah,
industrial necessarily as in building, smoke coming out of the factory, but they are like engineering and that kind of stuff,
yeah,
which is
absolutely.
a very good use case, right? For
And we had conversations down in the rural areas where it's primarily agricultural and ranch lands, and they were saying, well, part of what's limiting us from you know uh, making more money and having a bigger impact is the lack of refrigerated storage facilities. And it says we just don't have a place to put refrigerated storage facilities because it's all agricultural, and there's not a lot of industrial zones to build that kind of structure. And so we started having conversations around, could airports anchor refrigerated storage facilities for the agricultural and ranch producers. So you don't have to use an airplane, in the use of your business for the airport to benefit you. We can take advantage of those industrial uses that typically exist around airports and leverage that to serve your needs. And it was really exciting. We had a lot of momentum, a lot of excitement, within Utah across that. People were excited they could see their airports differently now. It wasn't just a playground for the wealthy and privileged. It was something that could actually serve them. And as all that was going on, and unfortunately COVID hit, which definitely had an impact on things. Um, the city of Los Angeles published a job opening, for an advanced air mobility fellow to come and help their transportation planners and land use planners understand aviation so that they can work better with the industry to figure out the right place for advanced air mobility to fit in with the transportation and land use landscape of the Los Angeles region. That was too good of an opportunity to pass up. And so I applied and was thankfully accepted into that position and got to work with some of the best planners on the planet in integrating advanced air mobility into the various strategies and things that are going on. And I always emphasize this integrative approach because something that we identified early on, even during my time in Utah, was early on the industry was positioning itself as a solution for congestion. And any transit or transportation planner can look at a four or five passenger aircraft that can land, maybe 5 times an hour, at a facility in an urban area. It's not going to put a dent in congestion, and so we tried to level set back to the fact that, hey, aviation has always existed to transport critical goods or time sensitive goods and even people, across different regions, and we don't see that necessarily changing, with the introduction of advanced air mobility. What we see changing is the calculus behind what we define as time critical or just in time type of deliveries. So whereas 4 years ago it might have been a critical piece of mining equipment that was costing a mine, $20,000 a day, by not being there. You know, Today you go to northern Utah and you had drone up delivering buckets of ice cream. Time critical, and important went from a piece of critical mining equipment to a bucket of ice cream and paper towels. And so that's how things are changing, with
uh,
all this. And
uh, well,
um,
that's really great to hear because the idea was with the advanced air mobility and these EV tolls and the paper that came out is that make it accessible, make it a normal thing in the market that you can go out and just consume that way of transportation. What's the biggest impact that you see happen? I mean, obviously, this is still all theoretical, but what's the critical impact that you see will be happening when these sort of services go live?
yeah, so when we, in a way, kind of debunked, the urban air mobility is going to solve congestion, for a little bit, these technologies became a solution that we're now looking for a problem. The good news is all regions have no shortage of problems, that need to be solved. Problems that are created by, a poorly planned or, maybe not a dated transportation system. And so when we look at this, and I like to look at it from an ecological perspective, in ecology we talk about diversity and the importance of diversity. And even the financial world, we know that a diverse portfolio is better than a portfolio that's just all, one thing. So that diversity is essential for resilience. And so now we look at applying that to the transportation system. Right now, most areas don't have a diverse transportation system. They're completely reliant on the roadways and single occupancy vehicles. And we can see the impacts of that, particularly in the event of a natural disaster where you got a hurricane coming and everybody's trying to take a single mode to get out of town, and it's clogging up, the roadways.
The roadways, the bridges, especially they get extremely
Exactly.
congested. You
Yeah.
can't get out of the city because you have to cross the river.
Right. Yeah. And in Utah, a couple of years ago, we had an earthquake, and it was, I think it was a 6.0 to 6.5. So it was a significant earthquake. And thankfully, it was just under the threshold to where a lot of our bridges were compromised, but we still had to close them all down and do inspections out there. And what we learned from that is if that earthquake had been any bigger, it could have turned into a mass casualty event, where the hospitals were going to be inundated, where they're going to have to create impromptu clinics all over the area. And getting people to those clinics and to the hospitals was going to be a challenge if the ground transportation system was compromised. And so, aviation as an element of diversity brings a new realm of resilience into the community. And that's something that I learned, that all community members can appreciate. And so we can take that and apply that to all the future facilities that might exist out there, from vertiports to drone ports or however it may be. We're thinking about it right now in terms of how can we alleviate it, you know, alleviate pains the transportation system imposes on certain people. And if we look at the air taxi concept, the initial users of the air taxis are still going to be very affluent. It's going
Yeah,
to take time to
absolutely.
scale and all
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so, similar to the airports today, the typical user out of the general aviation airport down the road here is very affluent. But in the event of an emergency or something like that, all of a sudden the airport becomes a lifeline. The vertiports become a lifeline. The drone ports become a lifeline. And that's important to communicate.
And I think this is really a very interesting point, right? Because one of the things I noticed, especially speaking with people in the industry around the world, the focus in the Western world is more that the AAM will still revolve around the airports and the infrastructure that already exists, and we have to expand, take that and expand on it, and that sort of approach. Whereas if you go to Far East or Southeast Asian side of, including China and other countries, the focus is more that they really don't think of that as an integration or expansion of the airport facility. They want to make it more sort of an integrated into your urban environment and into your localities and stuff. That's what their focus is. Slightly different approach. Do you think at some point we have to get out of that sort of airport based approach and then expand it into the same way those part of the world are doing? Is it going to merge? Is it going to still go its own direction? What's the because I think there's a propensity here to diversify, but it all depends on what the demand is and what's the appetite. So what do you see happening here?
Yeah, I think, and I apologize. I got jets flying over, so I'm trying to use my pause button, while they're flying
Yeah,
over. So,
yeah, no worries. I saw that. It's aviation. Let it through.
right. Yeah. So my final thesis and professional project in my master's program was: is there existing planning frameworks and planning paradigms that are aviation centric, similar to the way where, if you go to any transportation planning course or program, you'll learn about all the different types of planning frameworks and paradigms that you can apply from, what emerged in primarily Islamic countries. The Islamic city is a concept, planning concept that we focus on, the city beautiful, and just a lot of other, planning type of things. And so I was looking for something that might be more aviation focused, and I found something called two really popular ones. One is called the Aerotropolis, and that was pioneered by a professor, John Casarda, out of the University of North Carolina. And the other one was Airport Urbanism, which was written by Max Hirsch. And those folks looked at, basically thinking about airports differently, thinking about the land around airports differently, and complementing the airport with the right land uses and strategy that's going to get the most use out of that airport. And John Casarda particularly looked in Asian developing countries that were starting to build an airfield first, and then building the city around that to support the airfield. And the way he looks at it is that all the major cities throughout the world were built on the predominant mode of transportation at the time. And so you had all the cities that emerged along the spice routes. Then you had major cities emerging along ports, the major port cities, and then you
Major
had cities
ports or the
popping.
river, around rivers
Yeah,
that
the
we see,
river
like
ports,
like
right? Yeah,
London, river just runs through the city, right in the middle.
exactly. Yeah, and then you had rail cities, which is something that really took hold in the United States, and then of course the interstate freeway system, brought emergence to a lot of cities, to include Salt Lake City, in northern Utah where I live at. And so, is there a similar paradigm for aviation? And that's what John Casardo was really starting to look at, and how do you robust that? And most of what he was looking at was applicable to large international airports. And what I wanted to find out is how can we scale that down, so that we see that same kind of success at smaller regional airports. And the thing that I noticed immediately is that airports exist within a well insulated silo. And so, from the planning perspective, I wanted to understand how airports were thinking about this integration and how the communities were thinking about the integration. And so, I went out to about 5 airports and set up meetings with them, in my research, and asked them, first I would start with the cities and said, what do you think about the integration of your airport? How are you planning on integrating your airport? And the city planners essentially would say, oh, well, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, you said the word airport, you need to go talk to the airport manager. And so I said, all right, packed up my stuff, and I set an appointment with the airport manager and said, how are you thinking about the community integration, aspect of your airport? Oh, you said community. You need to go back and talk to the city planners. And I got that bounced around with all 5 airports. So
Oh God.
everybody, just wanted to live in their own little worlds, and there's
Yeah.
consequences. Similar to what I learned in the urban ecology program. There's unintended consequences that emerge from
Mm,
that.
indeed.
And I
Yeah.
think, to the point of your question, is we need to break aviation out of its silos
Yeah.
and start, getting people, indoctrinated into aviation that don't traditionally work in aviation, because it's going to be important to them. And that's something that I highlighted in my testimony last year as a part of the FAA's reauthorization, is that I looked at a number of different planning curriculums, certified planning curriculums at different universities, and many of them offered a transportation focus. But within that transportation focus, aviation was never discussed. Never. It's all focused on highway planning, transit planning, even active transportation planning, all very important, but they never brought aviation into that conversation. And so I was pleading, with the legislatures to essentially say, hey, let's start addressing aviation within this, so that a city planner at least has a high level cursory knowledge of aviation, so that when somebody like me comes and talk to them and says, what are you thinking about aviation integration? They can at least have a conversation and say, "Oh yeah, well I think about this, that, and the other thing." Let's bring the airport manager in for a fuller conversation.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, and that's why I brought up the question, because here on this channel, the Air Mobility Show, we want to be part of the education that is out there. So we want to educate people, we want to get the message out. The purpose of the advanced air mobility is to break that barrier and bring it into our communities. How do you see where you have that greenfield capability, especially in the Middle East, and where they are really pushing for it as well, integrating into their infrastructure? They want to be the first, right? So, and they have money to throw at it, so they might they might actually get away with doing that.
Yeah.
So that's one thing which I think is more of an opportunity than a problem. But then you have, on the other hand, old cities and established cities. You have likes of London and Paris and European and US cities, which are highly congested, but still will benefit from that capability, the last mile problem. But it's not really that easy, because you have to find a way to integrate already in a congested environment. I want your view on these two aspects of this. It's kind of an opportunity for us, right?
Yeah, well, like you mentioned, there's always opportunities, when you're starting from scratch, unique opportunities, when you're starting from scratch and building from scratch. And I think the thing to learn from that, that I'd like to see, particularly if we're looking at, a smart city type of environment, is, aviation, has brought in a lot of things that a lot of other industries and areas take advantage of. One of the things is weather. And so the need to travel at high altitudes across long distances has really provided a lot of benefits to our weather forecasting and prediction and observation system and ecosystem. And there's a lot of other industries that take advantage of that now. Aviation is a lot of times an entry point into other smart city applications. And actually, if you look at even in the other environments today, if you go to any city and say, all right, well, where can I see the most smart city applications, it's typically out at the airport. I say all that to say, all right, well, let's start out, and look at what are we building in aviation that's going to benefit, other modes, because if we're doing it just for aviation and just for ourselves, we're going to only get so far with it. Thinking holistically right from the beginning, particularly in the greenfield environments, is going to open up opportunities, and that might also open up, community acceptance, stuff like that, on there. The brownfield and the retrofit environments in old cities presents unique challenges on that. And I think that's going to be a little bit that's going to be unique for every city. I think it's desirable to want a template that you can apply, and I think at a high level you can create some kind of template, but every city is so unique and so nuanced that that template loses applicability in a lot of places pretty quickly, and you have to address the specific needs and issues associated with that. And so my recommendation is always start out with, where is the transportation system failing today? Who is suffering from that? And a lot of times it comes to the emergency services, and so because rush hour traffic in my old city is so bad, it can take an ambulance, an hour to get to me, and I'm only, maybe 10 miles away. And so how do we rectify that? Um, is there an opportunity to get some traffic off the road? I mean, and reduce the need to add new capacity building projects onto the highway system. Adding more lanes. Can we delay those projects by adding a mode and an option in the air? And so again, that's different for every municipality and every locality, but you had to start by having that conversation. When I was doing the work in Los Angeles, I would ask OEMs, how are you going to help solve the housing crisis? And the initial answers was kind of silence. And this is usually how it is, when you get bringing new people into the aviation realm, or vice versa. And it's like, well, I don't know, it's, we're aircraft, and but that's, once that seed is planted, usually a few weeks, sometimes a few months later, they would come back to the table and says, "All right, I got an idea. We're not going to solve housing, but we're not going to make it worse, and two, here's how a vertiport might benefit, housing, in some way, shape, or form, and we can bring that to the discussion, and if we're solving the problems, in a place like Los Angeles, the issues were always housing, homelessness, and public safety,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
so how can we frame AAM innovations around, being a part of the solutions, being a complement to the existing solutions, there it was always more palpable.
Absolutely, Clint. And me and you met a few years ago. One of the events, I think it was Air Taxi World Congress, and then the year after. And the air taxi has been the concept of air taxi and the eVTOLs and advanced air mobility has made a major breakthrough. And maybe 2024 was one of the years where public awareness about the technology and the future planning has become more widespread. How do you personally see the next 5 to 10 years of the industry transforming the lives of the people?
Yeah, the public awareness is critically important. And I was just listening to another live stream, where the public awareness and community education, was highlighted as something that was in critical need. And I think that's really, what's going to enable the scaling and to enable the implementation and maybe contentious environments. The challenge is whose responsibility is it? And the cities and the communities, a lot of times will say, well, it's the industry responsibility. If they want this change, if they want us to do this policy, they're going to have to do the awareness and things of that nature. Well, then the industry will launch an awareness campaign, which is essentially not necessarily an awareness campaign as a community might define it, but more of a PR campaign. And it becomes problematic because they're making forward-looking statements, um, that might not necessarily be true, when
Mhm.
the intervention takes place, and so then the industry will look back and say, all right, well, then we need help, and you need to do this with us. Well, because a lot of cities are focused on other things like homelessness, public safety and security and things like that,
Mhm.
they don't have the resources to dedicate and put time on an innovation that doesn't have an immediate need. And so we start spinning our wheels in this environment, and I think that's where a lot of nonprofits that are emerging in this space might be able to benefit. The challenge is when you're working with a community, in this my opinion, the focus needs to be on the community, and allow the industry to respond. And I have confidence in the industry in that if we put it out there and say, hey, if you want to work in here, then you got to be a part of the other solutions that we have in place. You can't come in here and drastically change, our transportation strategies. You have to
Mhm.
work within it. The industry is going to respond and do just that. And there's a lot of brilliant people working at a lot of the different OEMs and future operators that I've had those conversations with, and they have amazing ideas. But we need to have those conversations first, and find places to that can steward, and manage those conversations to make that possible.
And from a divergence point of view, because I see a small possibility that this is a slightly different thing to the general aviation. That also applies, I think, into how the policies and regulation need to be built out, and how the adoption need to be considered. And the only way I can see that, becoming sort of affordable for the masses, just like everything else that starts, obviously you have to pay a price to adopt it. When to get to that point, what are there are lots of promises, but that's what they are promises.
Yeah.
I don't know if there is execution towards achieving those promises. And again, what you just said is exactly what I see. The problem is that everyone have a deliverable, right? These people who are OEMs, they are buildings, they have a deliverable, so they're very focused on their deliverable. And then
Right.
your government doesn't necessarily have to, community doesn't have to pay for something that doesn't exist. So something have to give, right? What would that be? Is it going to be policy? Is it going to be a combination of everything? How do you see that?
Again, when you get into that micro level, at the city level, it's going to be different for everywhere. But I think that, again, that first step is outreach and education, and it has to be agnostic and unbiased. So when you get into outreach and education, forward-looking statements, can come back and bite you in the butt. So if we're
Absolutely.
saying, these aircraft are going to be silent, you're not going to hear them, and somebody hears them, they're going to say, "Oh, you lied." And so what else, do we have to question, in your statements? And so we need to level set, and be honest. And I found some success with this in Los Angeles, to where I did some research and found that the groups that were the most vocally against the advanced air mobility work that the city was proposing, and went and talked to them. And they primarily consisted of transit advocacy groups, transportation advocacy groups. And what I learned is that the framing, that we're using, the messaging that the industry is putting out there, is a big part of the problem. And so when there's a lack of information, the community will fill it up with the most outrageous and worst case scenarios that they can think of. And that's going to be the reality for them. It's not flying cars. This is aviation. And the operations are going to happen at aviation facilities. Framing the conversation back to aviation was beneficial in many ways. And so with a lot of these groups, I was able to ask them, what do you hate the most about aviation? And in Los Angeles, I was like, well, it's noisy. We have to deal with the helicopters flying over our heads, and it's hard to have a conversation when they're overhead, especially if they're going slow or loitering. It's polluting. We know that there's issues, and around many of the general aviation airports in the Los Angeles region, the lead exposure is becoming an increasing concern. And then the inequity piece. So I get to sit there and look at the airport, and I have to breathe the air and everything and deal with the noise, but I don't get access, to the amenities and benefits that the airport really provides. And so with that, I was able to take that and say, all right, well, with advanced air mobility, this is the next evolution of aviation, an iteration of aviation, not flying cars. And within this iteration and evolution, we're trying to make it more quieter. We're trying to make the emissions less impactful, and we're trying to make the equity, issues less prevalent. We're trying to make this open to more people, And so with the first two, we might see immediate significant reductions. They are far quieter, not silent. You will hear them, but they're going to be far quieter. And pollutions, if it's all electric, is negated, immediately, and that's of course the direct emissions. We still have to deal with life cycle, issues on that, but
Yeah, the
we'll
indirect
deal with that
impact
when it
on
comes.
the, yeah,
Right. And so I was able to go back to them and say, listen, like the three things that you hate most about aviation are the three things that we're trying to improve. And
yeah.
at the end of those conversations, they were like, all right, well, and this is similar to my experience in Utah. I still don't like what you're doing, but if this is improving those three things, then maybe we can stand aside a little bit and see where this goes. If you're
That's
if what you're saying is true, right?
that's so funny because I think this is a big problem when it comes to something new happening. Is accepting that this can
Yeah.
be different from whatever is coming. I mean, we see that happening with electric cars, right? For a long
Yeah,
period of time, everyone completely believed that every single electric car will just spontaneously take catch fire, or never
yeah,
going to work, or now millions of cars out there on the electric cars on the road, and it's absolutely fine. So I think, yeah, I think there's a the acceptance comes from knowledge. If you have knowledge, if you understand it. And one of the examples I gave is, there are people who are afraid of flying, and I know a few of them that who went and learned how to fly. And the reason was because it was the unknown. They just thought, okay, if something happened, just the plane will fall out of the sky and you will die. And what they didn't know is how much training pilot goes through when it comes to
yeah,
emergency procedures. I mean, more than 50% of your training is emergency procedures. And the plane is not just going to fall off the sky. You have so many things you can do. And that kind of alleviate the fear, and it comes from education, right? So I think this is the same thing. Um, so from aviation education point of view to planning. So let's say we come to a point where some of this is just happening, and then we see now some of these things are in the process of getting executed. We know that in New York they want to start some taxi services, and they are
mhm,
trying to, I think, operate out of the heliports that they have. I think that's your existing infrastructure, right?
right.
Uh, so going beyond that, if that happens, going beyond that, and let's say if I want to plan something that brings that capability into my neighborhood, what do you think is needed from a planning point of view and from a regulatory point of view to make that happen, and which we can't do right now, let's say.
There's a number of different processes, that exist for developing infrastructure, and that's, one of the reasons why I'd like to focus on infrastructure because, when you look at where cities actually have decision making authority within the aviation landscape, it's not in the operation of the aircraft, it's not in the structure of the airspace, or the development of the aircraft themselves. It's in the infrastructure, so cities and local jurisdictions approve where infrastructure can be developed, and even how it's used, so time, place, and manner, is where city planners work at. The challenge is again because they never get exposed to any kind of aviation planning in their careers. A lot of times they're checking boxes. They hired a consultant that came in, maybe developed a helicopter policy or a heliport policy for them. They trusted that heliport policy was developed, with in good faith and was accurate, and so they're just checking boxes per that policy that was developed without really understanding the whys behind it. And because of that, we can go and look at five to 10 different cities and look at the policies that might exist around heliport development, and some of them are good and very very well organized, and other ones are horrible. And they don't really protect the citizens, they don't really protect the city, and they certainly don't protect the operators. And so I think, from that perspective, also educating the planners on the different aviation planning nuances about the infrastructure, things of that nature, so that it can exist peacefully and safely within the community, is part of the challenge. And working with the states, working with the even the FAA, on the development processes, and just help them understand. And then the other thing is if you have existing heliports within your community, how do you understand and feel comfortable knowing that that heliport can be transitioned into vertiport use seamlessly? And I don't mean just by adding electric infrastructure and those kind of things. With heliports today, most, the vast majority of heliports today don't see a high tempo of operations. They're frequented, maybe once a day, a couple times a day. If they're a hospital, maybe a few more times. But even that's pretty low tempo of operations. When we look into scaled AAM operations, we're looking at multiple operations an hour. Depending on what's available there, to the even into the tens of 20s, 50 an hour has been proposed on that. And so to do that safely, adherence to certain design standards, airspace structures, things of that nature, that is all within the local jurisdiction's control, needs to be better understood. And it's not to say, and I get some flack from this from some of the OEMs saying, "Oh, well, you're trying to prevent us from using this heliport," and that's not the case. There's no aviation facility out there that's perfect. Airports, heliports, whatever, they all have deviations from standards. It's that risk mitigation process. So if that, say the airspace isn't protected at an 8-to-1 ratio as per the design standard, what mitigations can you put in place to make sure that you can still operate safely given that issue? And it goes into all the different aspects of the design. So if you have a deviation, that deviation inherently creates some kind of risk. Let's define that risk, let's understand that risk, and then let's do what we can to mitigate that risk or eliminate it, and so that we can still operate at a high tempo of operations.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, right? Because a vertiport, let's say, is being a heliport has been extended into a vertiport. So I think it's a dual function that it would be initially at least doing that. To still be operating as a heliport, but adding the vertiport capability. And I think the impact will be things like noise abatement rules. What is going to be the flight profile of these new devices, vehicles, how they will operate and sort of take off and land, and things like the surrounding environment. Respecting that environment, you have ecological impact. You have in certain areas even conservation impact, right? Because these even with the less noise, let's say these things make less noise and don't pollute as much. Flying low in a conservation area can be hazardous for the bird in that area. So I think there's a lot more at stake than just getting a permit for the vertiport and getting the permit to fly in that airspace. Do you think there have to be some kind of an effort, a joint effort, to bring those stakeholders together? We talk about OEMs and the communities and the agencies. I know there's nothing there, but if you are to plan something like this, what would be your recommendation?
We definitely need to bring all the stakeholders together. I think and we've done that, in a number of different efforts. I think the challenge in some of those efforts that I've been a part of is that it ends up being industry dominated. And so the industry come in and say, "Hey, we've done some research, and this is what you need to do, to create a policy for vertiport development. This is what you need to do to protect that vertiport and land use."
Hmm.
And it's all one sided. It's the industry talking to the community saying, "This is what you need to do." And it's frustrating on my part because I take part in these meetings, I see heads nodding, and I see a very amicable conversation happening. Then everybody disbands, and I go and talk to the communities that maybe took part, and they're like, they don't understand us, they don't understand our restrictions, they don't understand the dynamics of what we're trying to achieve with all this, and we can't do everything that they said that we need to do. And they're not appreciating some of the work that's done that maybe works against that. And I sit there frustrated and say, "Why didn't you say that? Why didn't you bring that up in that meeting?" "Oh, well, we don't want to be seen as as hard to work with, and there needs to be a way where people can share their ideas, concerns, and even frustrations a little bit openly,
Hmm.
without fear of reprisal, or of having some kind of consequence coming from that." Because there is again, the communities have expressed to me a lot of frustration, in how the industry is trying to work with them, and how the industry is trying to dictate what needs to be done without appreciating the challenges behind some of that.
And I think everyone benefit from looking into what others need. So the OEM should actually look at what your community need is, because if not, it will hit a ceiling that how many of these vehicles can fly around, or who is accepting it and who is not accepting it. Research that I have been doing so far, I've decided to make it open source, and I would like you to be involved as well as soon as it goes live, because I'm going to make it public. I realize that if we don't have this kind of unification, there will be no urban air mobility. What do you think about this approach?
No, I love it. I think anything and everything, to help on the engagement side, the education, the understanding, is all
Mhm.
going to be helpful. I see that people are starting to recognize that, hey, we need to step out of our silo,
Yeah.
step out of our comfort zone.
I come from an IT background, right? I've been working in IT and AI for the past 28 years. And in the IT industry, open source is a very common concept. In aviation, everything is IP, nothing is open source. So yeah, I think it will be fantastic. We'll have a conversation about that when
Yeah.
finally I get my act together and launch the the program.
you know Planning is planning. So if a city
Yes,
council or someone comes to the city planners and says, we're concerned about this, and we want to create policies, that um, to stop this, what this actually means is we need to create policies that respect the needs of the community.
yes,
It's
absolutely.
not necessarily to stop it, and whether you're trying to, get more, for lack of a better way of saying it, more stringent policies that respect the community's needs, you still need outreach and education for that. You still need research for that, and that research still needs to be unbiased. It can't be biased towards stopping it, any more than it can be biased towards trying to implement it. Unbiased education, is going to open minds. And to your point earlier about the risk and the fear, a lot of that is associated with a lack of information. And again, I believe in this industry. I believe in the value proposition of this industry and what we're trying to achieve here. And even if a community wants to stop it, that education is going to bring them back towards, more trying to figure out what is the right solutions for us, which is going to open doors.
What you're doing is obviously absolutely fantastic work. Really happy to have actually run into you, and thanks Nadia to actually introduce us and
My pleasure.
push me to email you again as well, right, Clint? Because you missed the first email.
No, I thought we'll
Yeah.
put the pieces of puzzle together because I think what you both do it has a lot of things in common, and we're just reaching the same goal. So
Yeah.
it's my big pleasure to have you introduced and also to be on this podcast, learning so much. There's so much to talk about, and I know that we cannot fit everything in just one podcast, but maybe we can welcome Clint once again on the next show and discuss the advanced air mobility.
It's been an awesome conversation, so really, grateful, for the opportunity to come on. There's all sorts of things, the different things that I'm working on that I'd love to talk about in future episodes.
It was an absolute pleasure, Clint, to have you today on the podcast. The work you are doing is absolutely fantastic. Both your approach to how to bring that technology and the capabilities that are possible with the future of advanced air mobility. You're the right type of person with all these different eye on all these different facets of advanced air mobility and aviation, which is absolutely key. And all the work that you are doing with the community and the nonprofits and all that, is inspiring work. It's a pleasure to have you on board, and hopefully we'll see you again many more times and discuss a lot more topics. But yeah, really enjoy having you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk with y'all. And yeah, it amazes me, what I've had the opportunities to do, and it's really, I've just had a blessed career, and lucky, in a lot of ways, and part of that is running into folks like yourselves and being able to share and learn from y'all.
Yeah, and I think the industry is lucky to have you as well, Clint. Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks everyone for watching. Please like, subscribe, and we'll be putting information about Clint and the other work that we are doing about the open source in the description. See you next time. Bye bye.